Texas Rangers Division is one of the most useful law enforcement agencies in Texas history. In my opinion, they're like a Swiss Army knife. They are essentially used for everything in any situation, whether it be enforcing the law and putting away everyday criminals or helping to fight for Texas independence. But you never really heard of a story where a group of Texas Rangers became Marines, right? Well, after the Texas Revolution ended, the Mexican government was obviously unhappy with the loss of their northern province. They refused to recognize Texas as a new nation and wanted to take back Texas at any cost, but for the moment they were helpless at regaining their northern territory, with Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna signing the treaties of Velasco, which ordered all Mexican soldiers to move south to the Rio Grande and leave Texas, leaving no Mexican force in Texas to commence another campaign. However, this did not stop the Mexican government, and to them the treaty was just another piece of paper, and they had no intention of following its orders. But they nonetheless needed to think of something fast, and since they had a lot of tired, sick, and injured Mexican soldiers on their hands, and learning from the disasters of Santa Anna's campaign, they couldn't just send them back. So the Mexican Secretary of War and Marine, Jose Maria de Tornel, had another idea. He would begin to build a massive naval fleet to perform convoy services and blockade the Texas coast for a second invasion, and would send agents to Baltimore and New Orleans to purchase new warships. The Texas government would get wind of the purchases of armored brigs being sailed to Veracruz and up to Texas. President David G. Burnett would hear of this from a man named William Bryan in June of 1836, telling him that a force of 15,000 Mexican soldiers were being assembled to reconquer Texas, and that he needed money, arms, and supplies for the coming attack. This was obviously surprising news, but it was still unclear if the Mexican government would attack a second time. However, an event near Copano Bay would prove Bryan's suspicions. On May 23, 1836, Secretary of War Thomas J. Rusk ordered Texas Ranger Isaac Watts Burton to lead a company of 20 mounted rangers and patrol the Texas coast from the Guadalupe River to Mission Bay. Rusk had heard of the reports of a second invasion and decided to not take any chances. Burton accepted his order and gathered a force of well-mounted and well-armed Texas Rangers. They would patrol the coast for 5 days when, on June 3rd, they were patrolling Copano Bay and saw a ship approaching from the south. They hid most of their numbers in nearby bushes, and Burton had a couple of his men unarm themselves and hail the ship. They frantically yelled at the ship in Spanish, where it replied by hoisting the United States flag, then the Texas flag, where the men remained silent. But when the ship hoisted the Mexican green, white, and red flag, they repeated their distress call. With this, the captain of the ship sent out a raft with 5 men to pick up the castaways, thinking that they were either Mexican soldiers or Mexican loyalists trying to escape the country. However, when the Mexican sailors came ashore, they were quickly captured by the Rangers at gunpoint and had 16 heavily armed Texans crammed into their boat. The Texans rowed up to the ship and captured it without a shot being fired. The ship's name was the Watchman, a supply ship from Matamoros, carrying a cargo of 520 barrels of food, along with clothing and military supplies for General Vicente FILISOLA's army. Only one person was reported to have escaped the capture, who was Colonel Juan Davis Bradburn, a Virginia native and former alcalde and tax collector of Anahuac, who was despised by the Texan people for his role in the Anahuac disturbances. He was leaving Texas on the Watchman to return with Santa Anna's army, and if he hadn't escaped, he would have either been killed then and there, or would have been executed when taken to a Texas port. The Rangers ordered the Watchman's master to sail to Galveston, but due to adverse winds, they delayed the voyage for nearly 2 weeks. They waited in harbor until June 18th, when the Texas Rangers would hit another stroke of luck, when 2 schooners, Fanny Balter and Comanche, approached Aransas Pass. Burton lured the 2 ships by flying the Watchman's usual ensign, and ordered 6 of his men and a local captain named James D. Boylan to take the ships. The two ships crossed the sandbar and approached the watchman, where Burton sent over his men disguised as sailors, who invited the two captains over for a glass of grog. When the captains came aboard, the Rangers took them prisoner, as well as their ships. The Rangers had captured 3 vessels over a 2-week time span. They would take the ships to Velasco the next day, and by June 23rd they anchored the flotilla in Galveston. Both Fanny Bolter, Comanche, and the watchman were later shown to a local admiralty court that condemned their cargo as prizes that valued over $20,000 to $25,000. The vessels, however, were later returned to their American captains, and Burton a month later distributed prize money to his Rangers, who achieved local fame. As a result of the seagoing safari, this launched the interesting legend of Texas Ranger exploits, and it also accomplished far more. After the Battle of San Jacinto, the Texan army had continued to grow. However, there was little food and no pay, and many of the men who were new recruits from the United States were unhappy with this. But with the captured bread, rice, and beans from the watchmen, this cooled the heated tensions that threatened to become a revolution against the new government. The Mexican government had called the act piracy, but the new Republic of Texas had survived its first crisis, all because 20 horsemen went to the Texas coast and became horse marines.